There's a moment almost every dog owner has lived through 1,000 times without ever really looking at it. Your dog is sitting a few feet away, and it's staring at you, not glancing, not checking in for half a second before going back to whatever it was doing. Staring, holding your eyes for 5 seconds, 10, sometimes 20, in a way that would feel almost uncomfortable coming from another person. Most owners have an explanation ready before the thought even fully forms. It's love. Maybe it wants food. Maybe it just wants attention. And honestly, that explanation isn't wrong. It's just missing almost the entire picture. Because here's the part that should stop you cold. Dogs do not do this with each other. Not with other dogs. Not even with wolves. The species they evolved from. The species they still share almost all of their DNA with. In the animal kingdom, a held direct stare is one of the most loaded signals there is. And by the time this video's over, you're going to understand exactly what your dog has actually been telling you every single time it locks eyes with you like that. Because the real explanation isn't really about affection at all. It's about something closer to an invention. And once you see this one behaviour clearly, you'll start noticing it everywhere. In the way your dog waits by the door minutes before you're actually due home. In the head tilt that shows up the moment your voice changes. In the sigh it lets out the second it settles against your leg. All of it, as it turns out, traces back to the same story. One that starts with a stare almost nobody has ever stopped to question. Start with the wolves, because that's where this gets strange fast. In a wolf pack, direct eye contact isn't a gesture of warmth, it's closer to a warning shot. Two wolves locking eyes and holding it is very often the opening move before a conflict, a way of establishing who's willing to back down and who isn't. Wildlife biologists who've spent years observing wolf packs will tell you the same thing. A sustained stare is one of the more reliable predictors that a confrontation is coming. Even among wolves that know each other well, that live and hunt together, a held gaze is rarely relaxed. It's a test. So think about what that actually means for a second. The exact same physical act, two sets of eyes locked together, carries something close to a threat in the wild. And yet in your living room, that same act is one of the clearest signs of trust your dog is capable of showing you. Here's a way to picture it that makes the whole thing click. Imagine a word that means something completely different depending on which language you're speaking. Same sound, same word, totally different meaning depending on the ears it lands on. That's essentially what's happened with eye contact in dogs. The signal itself didn't change. The translation did, and it only changed for one species, us. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because researchers wanted to know whether this was just something dogs had learned to tolerate, a habit picked up from a lifetime around people, or whether something deeper had actually shifted at a biological level. So they ran a study that measured oxytocin, the hormone most associated with bonding, the same one that spikes between a mother and a newborn during eye contact, the same one that floods a new parent's system the first time they hold their child. When dogs made prolonged eye contact with their owners, oxytocin rose sharply in both the dog and the person. Not a small bump, a real measurable physiological loop, running in both directions at once. Then they tried the same test with wolves that had been raised by humans from birth. Bottle-fed, hand-raised, never once exposed to a wild pack, as close to tame as a wolf can possibly get. And when those wolves made eye contact with the humans who had raised them, nothing happened. No spike, no loop. The hormonal response simply wasn't there, no matter how much love or familiarity surrounded that eye contact, which means it isn't exposure, it isn't upbringing, and it isn't simply a matter of how an animal is raised. Somewhere over the last 15,000 years or more, something changed at a biological level that no amount of raising a wolf by hand can replicate. Dogs didn't just get comfortable with human eye contact, their nervous systems rewired what that eye contact means. And they did it in a way their closest living relative, raised in the exact same environment, simply cannot do. There's another detail buried in this research that most people never hear about, and it's the kind of thing that sounds almost too precise to be real. When researchers tracked exactly where dogs looked, while scanning a human face they found something strange. Dogs show a measurable bias toward looking at the left side of a person's face first, the same side and the same pattern that human beings show when they read each other's expressions. Cats don't do it, wolves scanning human faces don't do it. It's a pattern almost exclusively documented in humans looking at other humans and in dogs looking at us. As though, somewhere in the process of evolving alongside us, dogs didn't just learn to tolerate human faces, they started scanning them the way another human would. But that's only part of the story, because if eye contact were the only thing that had changed, this would just be one interesting quirk, a strange footnote in the story of domestication. It isn't. It's the visible tip of something much bigger, and it doesn't stop at the eyes. Here's a comparison that tends to catch people off guard the first time they hear it. Chimpanzees share close to 99% of human DNA. They live in complex social groups. They use tools, solve problems, even recognize themselves in a mirror. By almost every measure we have, they're considered the closest thing to us in raw cognitive ability anywhere in the animal kingdom. And yet, if you point at something, a chimpanzee usually can't follow your finger to figure out what you're pointing at. It's not a matter of intelligence, and it isn't for lack of trying. It's that pointing, as a form of communication, simply isn't something their evolutionary history ever prepared them to read. A dog does it almost immediately. Puppies, with zero training, no rewards, no practice runs, will follow a human point to find hidden food at rates that put our closest genetic relative to shame. Some researchers have run this exact test on 8-week-old puppies who had barely spent any time around people at all, and the puppies still succeeded far more often than adult chimpanzees raised in research settings surrounded by humans their entire lives. That single test matters more than it sounds like it should, because pointing isn't really about the finger, it's about intention. To follow a point, an animal has to understand something fairly abstract, that another creature is deliberately trying to direct its attention towards something specific, that there's a mind on the other end of that gesture, actively trying to tell it something. Most animals, even remarkably intelligent ones, never develop the wiring to grasp that. Dogs somehow did. So how does an animal end up with a skill like that baked into its instincts before it's even fully weaned? The story starts thousands of years ago, near the edges of early human settlements, where the ancestors of modern dogs began scavenging for scraps left behind at the fringes of camps and villages. The wolves that could tolerate being near people, the calmer ones, the more curious ones, the ones whose stress response didn't immediately flood them with the instinct to flee or attack, had access to a food source the more fearful wolves simply didn't. Generation after generation, that one trait kept getting selected for, quietly, without any human ever deciding to breed for it on purpose. Not size, not strength, tolerance, comfort around us, an increasing ability to read what humans were doing and predict correctly what would happen next. And the pointing test is really just the beginning of what dogs turned out to be capable of reading. In one striking series of experiments, researchers showed dogs 2 photographs side by side, one of a person with an angry expression, one with a happy expression, while simultaneously playing an audio recording of a human voice that matched only one of those 2 emotions. Dogs, with no training at all, consistently looked longer at the photograph that matched the emotional tone of the voice. That means they weren't just recognizing a face or recognizing a sound in isolation. They were connecting the 2, matching an emotional state across 2 completely different senses, sight and hearing, the same way a person instinctively does. It's a level of cross-sensory emotional recognition that, outside of humans, is difficult to find documented almost anywhere else in the animal kingdom. Most owners never think about what happens immediately after that shift begins, but it's the part that changes everything. Once tolerance opened the door, a second kind of selection pressure kicked in almost automatically. The wolves that weren't just tolerant, but actually good at reading human behaviour, got better access, better food, better odds of surviving to pass that trait along. Over thousands of years, that pressure didn't just tame an animal. It built something closer to a new kind of mind. One shaped, generation by generation, almost entirely around understanding us. Reading our faces, following our gestures, picking up on shifts in tone long before a single word makes sense to them. If that sounds almost too fast to be biologically plausible, an animal's instincts rewriting themselves in a few thousand years, there's a famous experiment that shows exactly how quickly it can happen. Decades ago, a Soviet geneticist began breeding wild silver foxes, selecting only the calmest, least fearful individuals from each generation to breed the next. Nothing else. Not appearance, not size, only tameness. Within a matter of generations, remarkably few by evolutionary standards, The foxes weren't just behaviourally different. Their ears began to flop, their tails started to curl, their fur changed colour in patches. Traits nobody had selected came along for the ride, bundled together with tameness itself, as though calmness and those physical changes were wired to the same underlying switch. It's a striking preview of exactly the kind of transformation wolves appear to have gone through on their own, over a much longer stretch of time at the edges of early human camps. There's one detail almost everyone overlooks in all of this. This wasn't domestication in the way we usually picture it. Humans capturing wild animals and forcing them into submission. Most researchers who study this now believe it looked far more like a slow, mutual pull, one that neither species was fully steering. Wolves that could tolerate humans got more food and better survival odds. Humans who tolerated those wolves got early warning systems, help hunting, a layer of protection around their camps at night. Neither side controlled it. It was closer to two species quietly negotiating a relationship that had never existed anywhere before them. Think about how many of your dog's daily habits actually make more sense once you frame them this way. The way it follows you from room to room for no obvious reason, even when there's nothing to gain from it. The way it leans its full weight against your leg while you're standing at the counter, not asking for anything, just staying in contact. The way its ears track the sound of your specific footsteps, or your specific car, differently than they track anyone else's. None of that maps cleanly onto pack behaviour the way we usually use the term. It maps onto something narrower, more personal, and far stranger than most owners have ever had a name for. Which brings us to the piece almost every dog owner gets wrong. For years, the popular explanation for how dogs relate to us borrowed heavily from old ideas about wolf packs. The notion that a dog sees its owner as the alpha, the leader at the top of a rigid hierarchy that has to be dominated or obeyed to keep order. It's an idea that's shaped decades of dog training advice, entire television shows, entire schools of thought about what a well-behaved dog should look like, and it's largely outdated. Here's why it doesn't hold up. If dogs genuinely filed humans into the same mental category as other dogs, you'd expect to see the same behaviours show up in both relationships, but you don't. Dogs don't play bow at their owners the way they play bow at other dogs before a wrestling match. They don't attempt the same dominance displays with people that they use to sort out social order with fellow canines. The posturing, the muzzle grabs, the deliberate body blocking. Whatever role we occupy in a dog's mind, leader of the pack, at least in the way that phrase usually gets used, doesn't really describe it. Even the framework of a rigid dominance-based wolf hierarchy has been substantially revised by the very biologists who first popularized it, based on decades of further observation. So what is actually going on? A growing number of behavioral researchers believe dogs developed something closer to a third category altogether. Not fellow dog. Not predator or prey, the categories that govern most of the animal kingdom. Not quite parent, not quite peer. Something that doesn't map neatly onto any of the categories dogs use for the rest of the animal world. A classification essentially built from scratch over thousands of years that appears to exist for exactly one purpose, relating to humans and only humans. And once you see it that way, everything you've just learned stops looking like a collection of separate quirks and starts looking like pieces of the same picture. The eye contact that triggers oxytocin only with people, never with other dogs, never with wolves. The instinctive ability to follow a human point that our closest genetic relatives, with their staggering intelligence, still can't reliably manage. The complete absence of dog-to-dog social rituals in how dogs treat the people they live with. Even the muscle above a dog's eyes that produces that pleading, exaggerated puppy dog eyes expression. Researchers have found it activates far more and far faster when a dog is looking at a person than when it's looking at another dog. None of these are isolated behaviours. They're all symptoms of the same underlying fact. Your dog's brain evolved a bespoke social operating system that exists nowhere else in nature, engineered over millennia around one species, ours. Most owners never notice what happens immediately after all of this settles into daily life, but it's worth pausing on. That oxytocin loop from earlier, the one that spikes during eye contact, doesn't stay flat over time. Researchers who followed dogs and their owners found that the longer a dog and a person had lived together, the stronger that hormonal spike tended to become during eye contact between them specifically. Not eye contact with strangers, not eye contact with other dogs in the house. The bond appears to deepen its own biological signature the longer it's given room to grow, almost like a relationship quietly recalibrating itself, year after year, around one particular person's face. Here's where things become truly fascinating, because as far as researchers can tell, this hasn't happened anywhere else in the animal kingdom in quite the same way. Not between any other two species, wild or domesticated. Cats have lived alongside humans for thousands of years, and haven't developed anything close to this level of interspecies social wiring. Horses haven't. Even our closest primate relatives, despite sharing almost all of our genetic code, haven't. Dogs appear to be the only species in the history of life on Earth that built an entirely new category of social understanding, one that simply didn't exist before them, specifically to relate to a different species. Not adapted, not borrowed from an existing instinct, invented piece by piece over thousands of generations. Which means the next time your dog looks at you like that, holding your gaze just a little longer than feels ordinary, you're not imagining what you think you're seeing. You're watching the exact moment 15,000 years of evolutionary history quietly plays out in your living room. So picture that dog again. The one from the very beginning, sitting a few feet away staring up at you, holding it for 5 seconds, 10, 20, in a way no wild animal, no wolf, no other creature sharing your home would ever do without meaning something close to a challenge. You know now that it isn't a request, it isn't submission, it isn't even love in the simple, uncomplicated way we usually mean the word, though it certainly includes that, and probably always will. It's proof. Proof that somewhere in your dog's evolutionary past, biology looked at the relationship forming between your two species and decided it was worth building something entirely new for. Every animal on this planet understands the world through categories carved out by millions of years of survival. Predator, prey, rival, mate, offspring, stranger, threat. Somewhere along the way, without any blueprint to follow, dogs looked at us and built a category that had never existed before them. One with no ancestor, no earlier version, nothing to copy it from. That's what's sitting across the room from you right now, or curled up against your leg, or waiting by the door for a sound that hasn't happened yet. Not a wolf that learned to behave, not an animal performing loyalty in exchange for food and shelter, the way it might look from the outside if you squint, a species that quietly rewrote its own instincts over thousands of years until understanding you became one of the things it was built to do. So the next time your dog locks eyes with you and holds it just a little too long to be an accident, remember what you're actually looking at. You're not simply a person to your dog, you are the reason an entirely new form of understanding exists at all. And every single time those eyes meet yours and stay there, that's the story they're quietly telling you.